As we continue with the idea of taxonomy, and remember that taxonomy is just putting things into categories and then assigning each a universally accepted name. With those taxonomic categories that you learned about, from domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and all the way down to species, we mentioned that the top categories, domain, for instance, are very, very broad. And because they are so broad, there are very few of them. If so many different things fit into the domain eukarya, for instance, then you don't need that many domains. So there are only 3. In other words, every living thing on Earth fits into one of just 3 different domains: eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. I already described to you that to be in the category of eukarya, that just means that the living thing is made out of cells, and those cells have a nucleus. What that means is that category 2 and 3 there, those are made out of cells that lack a nucleus. We have a term for that. It's called a prokaryote instead of a eukaryote. The strange part here is that both 2 and 3, although number 2 is named bacteria, 2 and 3 are really both bacteria. They're just slightly different versions of bacteria. So category 2 here, bacteria, is a domain made of a cell without it. The living thing is made of a cell without a nucleus. And it happens to be what you would call, for lack of a better way to say it, normal bacteria. In other words, these are the bacteria that live in your refrigerator. They live probably on your skin. They are probably in your intestines. Okay, normal, everyday bacteria. They fall into that domain. They're made of cells, they lack a nucleus, and they live in, again, lack of a better term, normal environments. Down here, this third domain, archaea, they're bacteria, they're prokaryotes. In other words, they are made of cells that lack a nucleus, but they're extreme. They're not normal. For instance, these bacteria might live in polar ice caps. They might live at the deepest depths of the ocean where pressure is just amazing and other living things couldn't survive. So they live in extreme environments. So every living thing out there exists based on its characteristics in one of those 3 different domains. And then one step down from that, we have kingdoms. Kingdom's still a very broad category, not as broad as domain, but still very broad. There are only 6 kingdoms. Every living thing on Earth fits into one of those 6. And you can see, based on the arrows that I have added, the red arrows all represent kingdoms that fit within the domain of eukarya. So animals, plants, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of both of them, even fungi, funguses, and then maybe a category that you're not as familiar with, which is protista. These would be single-celled organisms, but they're not bacteria. Why? Because they have a nucleus. You may have heard the term amoeba before, or paramecium, or maybe euglena. Those are all examples of single-celled organisms that have a nucleus, and therefore they fall under this kingdom of protista. They are protists. So all 4 of those get divvied out from that one domain. Then we have one kingdom, eubacteria, that falls under the domain of bacteria. And we have one kingdom, archaebacteria, that falls under the domain of archaea. So I would just like you to know, because there are so few of them, it seems kind of simple to ask you to know the 3 domains, as well as the 6 kingdoms, and how the 6 kingdoms are delineated underneath those 3 domains. That brings us probably to the more important part that we have here in this particular screencast. When it comes to the idea of taxonomy, we said taxonomy is putting things into categories, but also assigning each of those living things a universally accepted scientific name. Let's talk about that phrase, universally accepted, for a second. That means it doesn't matter who you are, where you live, or most importantly, what language you speak. we can all agree on calling a specific organism by a specific name. The language that we will use for that is Latin. Latin is not something that anybody currently speaks, and yet a lot of languages derive themselves from Latin origins, and so they kind of seem like the perfect choice. Notice how those scientific names, those universally accepted scientific names, are created simply by taking the genus and species categories from the taxonomic descriptions that we talked about earlier and having that be applied to their scientific name. So for instance, when it comes to ourselves, we are in the genus Homo, we are in the species Sapien, and so to create our universally accepted scientific name, we simply put those two names together and we have Homo sapien. Binomial means to name, and nomenclature means naming, so we have two name naming. Here's one, here's two, put them together, and we have our scientific name. Do the same thing for the chimp that we talked about previously, and the scientific name will be Pan troglodytes. Do the same for the dog, and that scientific name will be Canis lupus. A couple of things to note about how those names are written. Notice, and it's maybe not painfully obvious because of the font that I've chosen here, but this is italicized. If you were reading a textbook and you came across a scientific name, it would be italicized. It would set it apart from the rest of the text of what you were reading so that you knew you were talking about the scientific name of a living organism. If you can't italicize something, as I assume you wouldn't if you were handwriting something, you would instead underline the scientific name to again set it apart from the rest of whatever was being written around it. The other things to note here would be that the genus name is capitalized. You can see it in both those examples there. And the species name is not. So if you're going to write a scientific name, you're going to capitalize the genus, you're going to have lowercase for the species, you're going to underline it, or if working in a computer program, you're going to italicize the scientific name. Lastly, just as a little bit of a tangent here, when it comes to taxonomy, we have the idea of cladograms. Cladograms use the categories, they use the characteristics of these living things to show you the evolutionary relationships that those living things have based on those shared characteristics. Earlier we talked about the human, the chimp, and the dog, and I said that the human was more closely related to the chimp than to the dog because we shared more taxonomic categories, therefore more characteristics. Cladograms are just a way to sort of represent those relationships in a visual picture kind of form. You can see that we've got 4 different cladograms on the screen, A, B, C, and D. They're all the same in terms of the intent. The intent is simply to show you the evolutionary relationships. They're just stylistically a little bit different, but one is no better than the other. All this is showing you, if we use letter A as an example here, is that time is being represented. So as we move in this direction, getting closer and closer to present day. As you move in this direction, you're going further and further back in time. And what this one single line here is showing you is that somewhere back in time, all the living things that are listed here were the same. They were one type of organism, one species. But as time went on, some groups of those changed, and they branched from each other and created 2 separate species. And then that second species branched, and then another branch occurred, and another branch occurred, to the point that all this branching led to present day, where we have crocodiles and birds and lizards and snakes as being very different animals, and yet they're related to each other. If we go back in time, the snake and the lizard were the same organism. And if you go back further in time, the snake, the lizard, the bird, and the crocodile were all the same organism. And they have branched from each other. They still share some characteristics, but not as many as they once did further back in time. And so each of these different representations here just are a different picture version of the exact same thing.